Welcome to Owl Talk, brought to you by Rice Digital Learning and Strategy, where we explore digital education in the 21st century and discuss topics like the future of digital learning, responsible AI in higher education, and innovative teaching and research in the digital learning space. Joining us today is Dr. Carolyn Levander, an accomplished author, professor, and nationally recognized academic leader. She currently serves as Rice's Vice President for Global Strategy, and she advocates for institutional global vision and innovation across the university. Dr. Levander is the author of Invent Ed, How an American Tradition of Innovation Can Transform College Today. It's a compelling book that examines how higher education can evolve to meet the needs of modern learners. She also played a foundational role in building Rice Online Learning, which is now known as Rice Digital Learning and Strategy. And in that work, she expanded access to high-quality coursework for millions of learners worldwide. In addition, she's a professor of English and holds the Carlson Professorship in the Division of Humanities. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us, and we're excited to have you on our podcast.
Thank you.
So first, I always like to find out a little bit about the guests so the audience can find out who we're speaking to beyond the biography that I just read. So if you'll tell us a little bit about your educational journey and background, a little bit of the research I was able to find is that you came to Rice as an undergrad, you got your graduate degree here, and your doctorate degree here, and have ascended the ranks of professorship to vice president. So tell us what made you select Rice as an undergrad, and a little bit about your time here at the university as a student and transforming into a vice president.
Sure, thank you. Well, I grew up in an academic family. My father is an art professor, studio art. So I grew up on college campuses, big state campuses. So University of Texas, Austin, University of New Mexico, University of Washington. So I grew up in that environment. And when I was looking to college, I was looking for a smaller institution, one that really valued the comprehensive nature of university education. So I was looking far and wide. I was very impressed with Rice when I visited, and really impressed when I was accepted and received a full scholarship to attend. And so I was making choices between East Coast schools, West Coast schools, and Rice. I'm really glad that I chose Rice. And then, after I graduated, my first job actually was in Japan. And so I worked for the Japanese Ministry of Education for a couple of years. So I was then thinking, yes, I want to go to graduate school. I was applying from Japan. So it was, old school. I used the telephone to call some faculty at Rice to say, where should I apply? And they told me here, there, the others. I applied to, again, all the great schools, but they said, you need to talk to Professor David Minter because he will be coming back to Rice University from his role as Dean of Arts and Sciences at Emory. So I called David, and he was just wonderful, and he said, you should apply to Yale, you should apply to Michigan, you should apply to Stanford, Penn, and you should apply to Rice and think about working with me. And so I applied to all those places, I got into all those places, but graduate school, so much is about having the right dissertation director. And so it was a real, thoughtful deliberation, but I'm so glad that I worked with the late David Minter. He was a wonderful mentor, a wonderful exemplar of the highest achievement and calling in this profession.
Wow. So you came in and got your doctorate degree. You're done. And what made you think, okay, let me stay at Rice or see what's available here? Talk to me about that transition.
I went on the national job market and got a number of job offers. I was actually a professor elsewhere for 5.5 years.
Really? I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And then David was retiring. And so the department was transforming in all kinds of ways. There were not a lot of people in our field. And so that's really when I was hired back with a very specific role to help lead the graduate program in American Studies. And so it was a whole different moment for the department, a very exciting time in the department. The department hadn't hired faculty for, 6 or 7 years. And so I was part of a whole new group of faculty coming in. So it was a really terrific time to, come in, get tenure, start working on the second book, and launch that chapter of my career and have graduate students, which was wonderful.
Yeah. So those graduate students have gone on and hopefully become faculty elsewhere.
They have.
And administrators. And so you're teaching and you're doing your research and your administrative duties as director of the graduate program there. Mm-hmm. How do you get from that to your first administrative role outside of the department on a university level?
So actually, it was very interesting. I was asked by the department to lead a kind of fundraising effort in honor of David Minter. And so I was part of this team that was responsible for raising money for the Minter Foundation, or the Minter Scholarship, which was really interesting, different work for me, but I obviously believed in the cause immensely. So that was terrific. And then we had a new Dean of Humanities who came in. I was on that Dean of Humanities search committee. And as part of that transition, what is now the Humanities Research Center, that leadership position was open. And so I was invited to apply for that position. So I directed the HRC for about 6 years, was writing my books and doing my graduate student training and undergraduate students, but really enjoyed doing that kind of work. So then I had an outside offer to go do that kind of work at an East Coast school, and the university said, "Well, why don't you stay at Rice, but do the kind of strategic leadership that you're doing within humanities, but across the university?" So that's when I moved into the provost and then president's offices.
Wow. So a keen interest on professional development and growing and administrative expansion as you're working through your work, right? You're not saying no to any of these options that are available, and you're progressing forward here at Rice. As a faculty member and as an early administrator, what are some key early wins that really helped launch your career administratively, like so that you could push forward and be seen in a wider lens as a vice provost and moving up into the provost and president's office?
So I think what I learned with the Humanities Research Center is the importance of really doing a thorough outside evaluation of an organization before you assume leadership of it. Mm-hmm. So I made doing an outside review a necessary precondition for accepting that directorship. And I'm very glad I did in hindsight. It was kind of a gut feeling at the time because it hadn't had an external review. But I brought in 3-4 of the nation's leading Humanities Center directors, and it was great to get to know them, see their eyes on the community and on the opportunity. And so that was an opportunity for the faculty across departments to learn about what a Humanities Center could be, to dream what we want this one to be. And that, I think, was a very useful way to assume a leadership role outside of my department. And then throughout my directorship, because the HRC is really equal opportunity, it's not meant to be a single department or even a few departments, primary research resource. It's meant to cross boundaries. And so I think the more that the programming that I developed with the advisory committee was about openness and making the HRC something that's a resource for everyone. I think that was a very important chapter of that center.
Wow, that's great feedback for aspiring administrators in university leadership, is to really have this outside assessment, because you have your own assessment, but sometimes the validity of outside perspectives can help you shape your own opinion in developing that. So your background as a professor and scholar certainly has influenced the way that you lead, whether it's in a directorship or a vice president's position. Can you tell me more about how and what aspects of the professorship and your scholarship really ties in to the work that you've done as an administrator?
Well, I would actually start at the very beginning of my scholarship. I mentioned that I worked in Japan for a couple of years. And so it was an amazing opportunity to see the United States from the outside in. And that was very valuable in my approach to American studies as my field of study. So many scholars of American Studies, grow up in U.S. universities, right? And so the field is very much an internally generated field in that way. I think seeing the U.S., not even from a European vantage point, but from an Asian one, was really valuable for the graduate research that I did as a student. And so my work is really, from the start, focused on transnational American studies, reframing the U.S. as the entirety of the object of study of American studies. So a lot of my work early on was very pioneering in shifting the paradigm away from a nation framework and to a post-national or transnational framework. And so I think that already suggests, the interest and the curiosity in doing things a little bit differently. And I think that is a through line with the administrative work that I've done subsequently, whether it's, in the online learning space, in the global strategy space, and also the work I've done outside of Rice University.
And it aligns so well with your current position, right? This global initiative, and having the opportunity to be abroad, study abroad, see the U.S. in a different light, and then giving those experiences, those valuable experiences, to our undergraduate and graduate students as they get to see kind of the world in a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So you're there and you're working and you're doing this, and someone taps you to say, hey, let's think about this new innovative strategy of Rice Online. Talk to me about how you move from the Humanities Center to strategy to Rice Online, and where that comes from. Where did that idea come from? Was the university embracing of it? And as I had shared with you previously, this is something that still in higher education is being discussed on whether it is a value added to institution. Can people really do online instruction? And they can if they do it really well. So when we look back at Rice, this is a part of our innovative history, is launching these MOOCs course, and you played such a pivotal role. But talk to us about how that came about, and what were the ideas, what were your challenges, and that entire process.
So there's an important chapter, which is that my first really big project as the VP for Strategic Initiatives was the Moody Center for the Arts, really building a trans-university arts program that connected with the city of Houston. And that was a multi-year project. We see the benefits of it today in that beautiful facility with its incredible program. But that also was an institutional first. It was the first time that there was a building constructed, named and constructed, that was not owned by a school or a department, right? But that was truly meant for the entire campus and to encourage arts making, computationally dynamic and robust arts making, for engineers, for scientists, for humanists. So that was a deep learning experience. And certainly, it wasn't without its challenges. I like to see the success at the end, which is this incredible jewel in the crown of the institution, for sure. And I think along the way, the president, the provost, and trustees saw me as someone who could make transformational change at the university. And then along came Coursera and edX, right, out of nowhere. And I will never forget the president saying, I've spoken to some of the trustees, and we'd like you to just kind of lead this MOOC thing, whatever this MOOC thing is. And so I said, well, okay, sure. And I had received an IMLS leadership grant, an Institute for Museum and Library Sciences leadership grant to build a digital archive, the America's Archive. So again, I mentioned my research being transnational. That project was about how do you create a research archive that doesn't reinforce national boundaries. So if you go to Library of Congress, you basically search along nation lines, right? Is it U.S. history? Is it Mexican history? And the dates are pretty much the dates of national chronologies. So it was a really terrific project, $1.5 million project to build an archive that would allow search functions across some of those guide rails that limited the ability of researchers to look across nations. And so I think there was kind of that experience that made me interested in, okay, what is this MOOC thing? I think that none of us really thought it was going to be what it has turned into. Wonderful learning experience for me because, as you know, I mean, the initial courses that were in demand were really STEM, quantitative disciplines and fields. And the thing that really impressed me about Rice faculty is the appetite to experiment with the tools themselves, right? So there were a lot of universities that had faculty who were interested in building the content. Rice had faculty who were interested in building additional platform capabilities. And that, I think, is an expression of Rice's highest research ambition. I think that's distinguished us from the start. And certainly the computer science department was a pioneer in that. But I think it was great to see faculty across the university wanting to get in there and play with the tools. And as you know, I mean, gosh, the next few years were wild ones in terms of what does this mean for higher education? Is this the biggest disruption of higher education? What is the value proposition of a school like Rice? Of course, Rice is a very residential college. We, don't have a history of online education. So it was a pretty dramatic departure from the status quo here back in, the 13, 14, 15 period. But I think that sea change, I think the importance of it was gradual, and the Faculty Senate was a hugely important collaborator for me in this process because it was over the course of, 3, even 4 years that we did a series of white papers, research papers, a subset of Faculty Senate, and I was part of those working groups. Really, what are the university faculty's values around online learning? And that was a very deliberative process. It was a very careful process. But the final outcome of that allowed us to create a university policy. And that policy was absolutely essential during COVID. If we had not had that policy when we had to do that pivot, it would, I can't even imagine. But we had guidelines, right? We'd had this multi-year thorough Senate assessment. We had experience. It set us up to be resilient in a multi-year, serious shutdown of higher education.
And you were ready. It's almost as you were,
but we didn't know.
Were preparing for it.
But we didn't know, right? That's the thing, So hindsight is always 20/20. But even with COVID, I will never forget how hard the Rice Online Learning team worked to get best practices to faculty across the entire campus. And you may need to look back if you haven't seen them already in the archive, these pictures of all these faculty sitting side by side in Fondren Library, in the big room, the Kyle Moore room upstairs, with their masks on, all learning how to do these basic things together.
Wow.
It was an amazing chapter. And our OL team was there helping people out. And then, of course, making sure that all faculty had the resources they needed, whether it's arts faculty, computer science faculty, physicists. So it was a real university effort.
So we take this moment of launching the early MOOCs and the COVID situation that really transformed higher ed worldwide. And we start to think about these online graduate programs. So how do you move from this era of disrupting kind of the tradition of Rice University with not previously delivering online courses to then moving to these massive online courses to getting through COVID to then launching internally online programs? So
actually the online MBA was our first one. And that was because, I had been trying to softly sell, anyone want an online master's program? And Dean Peter Rodriguez, it was new to Rice. He come from Darden. He saw the incredible importance of online for the whole kind of business environment. So he already was a champion of it. It was very much at that time the direction of B schools and, being sort of trapped by the residential community was a real limit for a lot of the business school, student opportunities. And so he came in with that knowledge. He and I worked together really closely on how to get the faculty behind an online MBA. And, I did a call for proposals. We looked at a lot of third-party providers. We, at that point, didn't really have the conversation about doing it in-house. It was really about what's the best partner, because Peter and I agreed we wanted to go to market really fast with the Jones MBA because we were a little bit behind, and so speed to market was the top priority. But, I spoke to the faculty, all of the B School faculty. They, as B School faculty, they had looked at all the financials. They approved to you as the partner. And, the benefit of it was they got that first year of students really fast in the chute and with a really good product. So that was our first experience. And watching that and learning from it was invaluable, not of course to the Jones School, but to Rice Online, to me, to the university proper. So when we thought about, okay, what's next, clearly engineering was the place, a great opportunity. And so we were looking there. I think the engineers, the build or buy, right? They tend to like to build. They're builders, and that had characterized our faculty from the start. And so really at that point, the question is, is it our responsibility to build the learning ecosystem of our future? And I think the answer is yes. Certainly you can buy as needed, but to be totally dependent, to totally outsource that is not what Rice is. I mean, we don't outsource entirely our housing and dining, capabilities. We have our own police department, right? So, I mean, the university's philosophy is very much not to contract third parties for these kind of core functions. So I think the consistency is absolutely there. The online MCS was slower to market than the MBA. Department had to vote on it. A lot of back and forth, different visions. But as as we discussed last, I mean, look at it today. It's so highly ranked, so successful, and really set us up for the other online master's degrees.
Yeah, and it was a great invention from us internally that other programs are now still leveraging as we continue discussing launching certificate programs and new degrees. So thank you for your work on that as well, because that lays the ground and foundation for us in Rice Digital Learning and Strategy to use a lot of what was built, right, as our foundation, discussing the future of these new degrees and certificates. So let's talk about the book. We learned a lot about you, your career, and all of your accomplishments here at Rice. I'm always interested when I read a book about the author, right? I want to know a little bit about them, which we've learned. But I also want to know, at what moment did you figure out, hey, I've got to write about this, or this is a topic, or this is something that people need to know about. What in your administrative career or personal life or professional life transpired or happened or motivated you to conceptually think about this work?
So, English professors write books. So I've written a number of books. Right. So that was not sort of a big, departure. It was not, am I going to write a book, but what will my next book be? And of course, doing, vice president leadership work is very time consuming, but it's very important to me to be an active academic. Mm-hmm. And so I have graduate students, and it's very important for me to have an active scholarly life. So it was, it was interesting because I have this long career as an academic and a lot of expertise in that domain. And I had also accumulated a lot of experience as an administrative leader, not only within Rice University, but outside, in various other leadership roles in higher ed. And so for me, the question was, how might I bring those two together in a way that's really valuable for the public. So at this point, I don't need to write books to be promoted. I don't need to write books to prove myself as an academic in my field anymore. So that's a great freedom. And so, I wanted a book that would be useful to everyone who's interested in universities, who's confused by universities, who's scared of universities. And so really, for me, it was, how do I tell a story about universities, American universities, that is both accessible and interesting and makes sense to people who want to benefit from what we offer but don't really know how. So that was the spirit of it. And you've read the book, which is very, very wonderful. And so you know that the first section of the book, there's 3 sections. Mm-hmm. The first section focuses really on the past, right? Which is my scholarly area of expertise. So from early colonial America through, the early 20th century, and the ways in which the country evolved and succeeded through the inventive work of our inhabitants. And that's an important and often forgotten component of what makes U.S. universities today so important, right? So we often think we tend to be future focused in our industry. Most industries are, right? What does the future hold? But less looking to the far back. What has made us really distinctive from the start? And so that was an important place for the book to begin, then to tell the story of innovation, discovery, creativity that's relevant for 21st century students and their families.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the first part of the book where you gave the analogy of the museum or the startup. And when I started to read the book, I thought, what does she mean by this, right? Like it's a great analogy when you read the book and you reflect back and say, oh, I see what she's saying. Where did you come up with that analogy? How were you thinking when you thought about the museum as like really knowledge acquisition and the startup as like this futuristic creativity and innovative kind of process that we need? Where did you get that analogy? It's brilliant.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, so the book begins asking, are U.S. universities museums or are they startups? And where should they be on that continuum? And a museum is the place where we go to see the accumulated wisdom of the ages, right? It's where all the important objects, books, stories are carefully curated and protected so they don't deteriorate with time. And of course, startups are these messy spaces that are all opportunity and
disruptive.
And all about kind of what could be, and experimenting, see what happens. Lots of failure, some success. We hope. Will that success stand the test of time? Who knows? But these are 2 very different visions of what a university might be. And so to me, that's a really important question for universities. And it doesn't have to be all one or all the other. I think most universities exist on a continuum. And sometimes part of the university is more at one end of a continuum, part of it's more at the other. That's all fine and good. My question, though, I think is provocative because Invent Ed argues that we don't spend enough time thinking about that fundamental question as academic leaders. And we need to if we really want to optimize our students for high impact, meaningful careers over the decades.
Yeah, and you offer some really thoughtful critiques and clear examples of how higher education sometimes stand in our own way. And in particular through like tradition, bureaucracy, and this like underlying resistance, sometimes explicit resistance to change, right? How do you navigate the balance between being candid, like in this critique, while still engaging the audience that will align and read this book that really is a thoughtful analysis that offers some recommendations, right? How did you balance that line? And for those institutions that still want to remain traditional and bureaucratic, And when leaders are posing the question about being a museum or a startup, sometimes those leaders can be cast out of the system totally because they're too provocative in addressing whether they should be a museum or a startup. How did you navigate that criticism and the recommendations and engaging the audience in the book? And what would be your recommendations for leaders out there that are challenging that question against their audience of an institution that is more museum in their startup or vice versa?
Well, let me make a few observations. One big reason I wrote this book is I think there are a lot of university bashers, right? People who actually are not within universities but find a lot to criticize about them, right? So there's a lot of these sort of external popular books that are getting written not by people who actually really know what they're talking about. Universities are really complicated financially, structurally, in terms of governance. And I mean, they're very complicated places. So there's a lot of misinformation and critique from the outside that's really damaging and uninformed.
And unfair.
Well, yeah, because it's actually uninformed.
Yeah.
And then there are a lot of books written by presidents after they step down, right? Derek Bach, for example, these wonderful, very thorough books about higher education, really written for people inside who really know universities, who, again, it's a small specialized audience. I saw a huge need for a book that was written by someone who understands universities from both a faculty perspective and an administrative perspective, has a deep love for universities, and a desire for the public to really understand, one, the value of our universities, and two, how students can get the most, how they can extract the most value while they're students. And how universities, our faculty, our staff, our leaders, can intentionally make some tweaks and adjustments that will help optimize for those successes. So I come at this, as I said, with a deep, love for the academic mission. I think U.S. universities are incredible engines of economic prosperity. I mean, the data shows it. Amazing engines of knowledge creation and translation. The number of new industries that U.S. University research generates is remarkable. People ask me, well, what are U.S. universities going to do about AI? It's like, hang on. Researchers have created AI in universities, right?
It's ours. We own it.
Yeah. So let's, it's not being inflicted on us, right? So we're not the passive recipients of this, right? We have a research machine that produces, these breakthroughs.
It was born out of university,
That's right.
Where
That's
knowledge
right.
is generated.
That's right.
You'd mentioned earlier about the American method of invention, which I found that section of the book just fascinating.
Great.
I'm not into American culture history, but you took us through the journey of the pencil, the wooden pencil, right. All of it, right? And you talked about that method specifically, but how did you draw on the historical lens to connect it to the early foundations of American higher education system? As someone who has studied American higher education, I had never really thought thoroughly to look back at a historical lens through the American culture and its kind of evolution on the university.
Right.
And you did such a good job of that. How did your previous training in American studies and culture really allow you to look at the American method of invention differently and apply it to higher ed?
Yes, great question. So Invent Ed shows how it's not just that the early inhabitants of the country had all these problems to solve, right? They're out in the wilderness. There's not a lot of resources. Unlike Europe, that had very mature universities and knowledge societies in, a very compact geographic area. So there's much more of a network in Europe for problem solving. So then you get these people in the U.S., right? And they're dispersed. They've got all these problems. And so the method of invention that kind of organically springs out of that context is, as you know from reading the book, is one that is about putting existing tools and materials in new combinations, right? That's the definition of invention, of creativity, right? Not creating new things out of whole cloth, but putting existing matter into new combinations to solve a particular problem. So the book shows we had to get really adept at that, right? In kind of the,
American culture,
in American culture, right? Because we didn't have this infrastructure of universities. And then as we began to build these universities, the journey of that method of invention from, the wilderness into the laboratory was a fascinating pathway. Mm-hmm. So it was not a straightforward shot. U.S. universities, particularly East Coast universities, very much looked to Europe to credential them, to train their faculty, and also to import the best methods as well. And so there was this tense relationship between this organic U.S. method of invention, which is much more startup mentality, and the model of the European university, which was much more about, refereed knowledge formation, et cetera. And so those two came together in U.S. universities in kind of tense ways from the start. And the story of our early universities is so fascinating. I mean, the experiments that they made in trying to, tease out what the optimal relationship between these two might be, just really fascinating stuff. So, of course, I show we inherit that even as U.S. universities after the wars became the science incubators that have generated national prosperity over the last 80 years.
Yeah, and one important fact that I deeply appreciated is that you left out that fact of invention in U.S. history wasn't built for everyone.
Right.
You touched on a very particular topic.
That's right.
That is longstanding in our American culture. And you also push for the readers to really think about innovation as something that requires diversity.
Yes.
Diverse perspectives,
Yes.
thoughts, lived experiences. So talk about how that role in the early parts of the book really impact higher education. And some would argue we haven't really progressed forward in where we are today.
Thanks for observing. That was a very important thread in this book that, while everyone was out there solving problems in their daily lives, the phenotype of the American inventor very quickly became white and male, right? And there were various reasons for that. Law did not allow people of color or women the same rights and privileges in terms of patent law, in terms of even being able to claim proceeds from the benefits of their inventions. So it was a stacked deck that quickly led the American inventor, and we see it today, right, to be, when I say that, there's a certain person, a certain persona that comes to mind. Mm-hmm. And so the book is very much about acknowledging that and saying, look, universities have been amazing places in terms of really egalitarianizing our student bodies and our faculties, right? That's one of the things I love about U.S. universities the most. So from Brown v. Board onward, this has been a real commitment of our institutions. And, as as part of that, we've diversified our curriculum so that we have courses on African American history or Chicano studies, right? So we've brought the stories, the histories of different
marginalized groups.
Different peoples into the learning commitments of our institutions. So this is not a critique of the university. In fact, it's merely an observation that we have a little bit more work to do, and that is to really bring to the inventive process the diversity of perspective of all of our students, really to leverage that in ways that are thoughtful and, as I said, intentional.
Yeah. You'd also mentioned how there was this kind of tension between this inventive American culture within America and this East Coast European model, and you specify that the American method of invention within the curriculum of higher ed at the time really was about practical applied learning, and over time the institutions have now shifted more towards this European model, which really specifies different divisions and highly specialized areas of knowledge. How did that shift shape the way that you think we still teach today in universities? And what, if anything, do you think we've lost in the process that's really worth reclaiming as academics?
Yes. So we all know that there are more departments and disciplines and subdisciplines on U.S. campuses than there were 20 years ago. And so, we didn't have computer science departments 80 years ago. So it's important that we get new disciplines because that reflects the ongoing, discovery work that we do as colleagues. And it's important that we don't get rid of the older disciplines because that is the accumulated wisdom. I mean, universities have a responsibility to collect and maintain the accumulated wisdom of humankind, right? So that's very important. So I'm not arguing we should give up either of these things. But what I do think has happened, understandably, is that, look, as faculty members, we are trained to make an original contribution in our field. Mm-hmm. And our field is very focused. And that's how we get promoted. That's how we get tenure. That's how we get our articles written and our books published, and that's how we get grants. So we need that disciplinary rigor, absolutely. That's a piece of the discovery process. I think what has happened at the undergraduate level is that often students come in and they're really just focused on getting their major requirements done. And that's where we do a disservice to students. We have general education for breadth, but we don't really lean into how do we get different kinds of knowledge in an undergraduate student experience to really nudge them to think differently. And that's really important these days and times because our students come in more siloed at 18 years old than they were when I went to college, and I don't know, maybe when you went to college too, but they come in already more specialized with the belief that they're good at this, but they're not good at that.
Yeah. Or their prior experience. They
Right.
could never learn this.
That's right.
Or that. You speak about the cross-disciplinary approach and the diversity and how we should afford those students these options, right? And you also mention the dropout culture. And you don't reason it because of higher ed. And we know, you and I both as administrators, there's multiple reasons. There are students who were never going to succeed in college. There are students who, with more support would have, with better accurate assessment of a more aligned major maybe would have. But in terms of the dropout culture in our modern university, what do you think the framework with Invent Ed could help faculty and administrators think about the system that impacts student retention and student success from the perspective of these highly specialized fields and in some instance, lack of cross-disciplinary education that could play somewhat of a role in the dropout, right? And the student's inability and the family's inability to see the practical applied learning's return on investment.
Right. So dropout culture is many cultures. So there's many reasons why students don't persist. In the book, I look at one culture of dropout culture, which is the kind of Bill Gates, Steve Jobs dropout culture, right? You
even, I think, mentioned the Steve Jobs coming back to take that auditing the course.
Right,
where
the calligraphy course, yeah.
That moment of him being a dropout,
right,
but yet still engaged in the learning process of a university.
And so I really talk about that kind of the cult of the dropout, because too cool for school, right? That the school isn't providing the educational excitement that highly creative inventors need and want, right? And so that's very different from a student who can't persist because of economic issues or work issues. Those are different problems entirely. Regardless, all of those students should be challenged and encouraged and excited by the ability to actually grow creatively in every single class they take, right, throughout the curriculum. So it may not solve it for, students who actually really just can't take the time or, pay the bill, But for students who have a choice, InventEd really shows like what would have happened, right? If Bill Gates, who loves history, by the way, and is like this huge supporter of global history, right? If he had actually stayed longer and been more creatively provoked while he was an undergraduate, what could have happened? And I also show that while it's very seductive to think, Steve Jobs didn't get a degree, and look what he did, we know that for the vast majority of the population, the need for education, mentoring, and thoughtful direction in those pivotal years optimizes students for success over time. So we know that to be right. Really good thing that Steve Jobs decided to sit in on a calligraphy class. Terrific for all of us with our iPhones and our Macs, but fact of the matter is it shouldn't be that random.
Yeah, because what if, right? What if?
What else are we missing?
Yeah, so in the last part of the book, you really give these recommendations, which makes the book a really strong text, right? From this perspective of here's diagnosing what happened, here's where we are, and as you had indicated, some of the critics of higher ed in their book there. But you, as an internal agent with years of experience and tangible, practical, hands-on experience, are able to say, in turn, here are some recommendations for faculty, and here's some recommendations for you as a student, right? Which I thought was really interesting, that it spoke directly to the students and saying, hey, you have a role in this too, and here are some of the things. But you talk about creativity and innovation and the renewed emphasis on creativity in the workforce, and how platforms like LinkedIn are doing this analysis of creativity being adaptability, problem solving being some of the top skills that employers are looking for. And you also reference, again, this practical applied learning that the families expect, right? So how do you see the rise in that juncture of a conundrum, right? Really, here's what employers are looking for, here's what families and students are looking for. Some universities, some institutions, some courses, some faculty may be providing it, some may not. So that's where we are. How do you see the creativity shaping the workforce, and what responsibility do we as higher education administrators and faculty have in helping students and families through that?
Right. So everything we know, and with AI transforming the workforce, we know the premium is on a creative workforce. And the evidence is vast and growing. So we know that. And top-notch employers are actually having to reverse engineer creativity into their workforce because universities aren't doing it well enough. So we know we have a problem, and it's a problem exacerbated by AI. And so we all have a role and a responsibility in solving that problem. So faculty, and I can say it as a faculty member, we come out of a system and we learn from our professors how to teach, largely. And regardless of the discipline, too often, and I'll say this of myself, I and many of my colleagues and friends would admit this, we go into a classroom, of course we want to stimulate, a growth mindset, but the fact of the matter is, we know the smart kids, we know the ones who are going to say the right answer fast, and we rely on them too much. And what that does is it really reinforces a fixed mindset in students, as opposed to us committing to building a growth mindset in all of our students. And the difference, as we know, is a fixed mindset is very much, I'm not good at math, I can never write well, I'm not creative, I'm not artistic, I'm bad at physics, right? Just as, you have brown eyes, you're a certain height, these are preordained at birth and they can never change. That's a fixed mindset. A growth mindset is, I can do anything, I can build any muscle, I just need time and support to do it. And we can encourage the growth mindset in our classes, no matter how small the class is, no matter how big the class is. We just need to really thoughtfully commit to doing that. And I believe most faculty, we're just habituated, we just don't think about it. And so, most faculty want students to thrive. So if we can, we'll try and do the right thing. So that's faculty's part. students and their families need to step away from this, ridiculous obsession with the GPA and, such a conservative approach to course selection. I'll only take the courses where I know I can do well. It's so cutting off the nose to spite the face, because it's a way of circumventing the vulnerability it takes to really grow, and in that growing process to figure out how to create. You do need to fail to learn how to create, and it has to be okay.
Yeah. Can you give us an example as a professor of perhaps one of those students that you took on, and immediately you have 4 or 5 graduate students, and 2 or 3 are going to knock it out of the park. They're turning everything in. Chapter 1 is due. They're on target, right? They're preparing their academic papers. And then you have these other 2 that are just ones that it's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah.
And you really have to change their mindset. What is an example of you as a faculty member and how you've assessed, evaluated, and a tangible, practical thing that you did that helped someone challenge their mindset and move from a resolved mindset of maybe I'm not good enough as a doctoral student to, you know what, I finished this program and I just got offered an assistant professorship at University X?
So I think I can answer that question. First, I would answer with a student who didn't commit to a growth mindset, a graduate student who was absolutely committed to writing on a particular topic. And this topic, and I said, look, this topic, you're not going to get a job with this topic. It's just not going to happen. And I don't want to be negative, but it's my responsibility to tell you that you're really setting yourself a hard, if not impossible, task if you continue down this pathway. That student was not willing to grow and say, okay, and I wish I was wrong, but I wasn't wrong. So that's, where the student needs to be comfortable enough being uncomfortable, right, to take in the message. I don't think that there was a different way I could have delivered that message so that it would have been heard, right? It takes both.
Yeah.
It really takes both. Yeah, I mean, it really takes both. And so, and I, many times, many different ways.
Circle it back around, organic, intentional.
So it really, it does take, it's a community effort, I would say. But I think what's important, and this is, we're talking graduate level work. The book is really focused on undergraduate education, which they're very different kinds.
Different. But it showcases your ability to assess, evaluate, and the skills that it takes to be able to say, okay, I'm going to have to approach this.
Yeah.
And the many attempts you took, right? Where then in the end, it really is the student's responsibility.
Well, it is. I would say one of the things that helps, at least at Rice, undergraduate students get comfortable with writing, because a lot of Rice students are not comfortable writing because they come in sort of engineering STEM more, was, I took a course as an undergraduate that the single most valuable course I took was a computer programming course. And it was, again, I just took it randomly. No one intentionally said, take this, it's very different from, but it'll help. But it was a wonderfully useful course in showing me the deep logic that connects programming with writing. And so often when I find I have students who are really struggling with writing and they think it's a black box, I don't know how to do it, I say, how do you write a program, right? Think about that. Words are tools you use. You're developing an argument, like you're developing a program. You want to get us convinced of your view at the end. So how do you do that? And I do see the light bulbs going on really frequently there.
Yeah. So we know that most complex problems in our world today don't fit in one discipline, right? Even when we talk about AI, we can talk about AI and the complexities of like engineering, but we can also talk about AI and humanities and ethics of AI.
Right.
But what I often believe is institutions are still largely operating in silos, right? In my attempt in my career to offer or create interdisciplinary degrees, whether it's at a community college or a public state institution or at Rice, it's very difficult to create interdisciplinary degrees. The discussions go on credit hour, who's getting funded, how are we going to pay for this, right? all really progressive discussions, but challenging, right? So what does it actually take to encourage and reward institutions, faculty, administrators, to really think about that diversity of disciplines and interdisciplinary thinking that can provide these students who are not stimulated or need the extra push or are not in a creative space to be able to take these things to help them kind of in that creative mindset, right? For me, as you had indicated, at Texas Tech, my undergraduate, I had to take a class, like a specialization class in one of these 20 courses. And I went to go register, and the last class that was available was the history of female sports. So I took it, and I'm like, oh God, what is this class, right? It's one of the greatest classes I've ever taken, right? And it really transformed my mindset and, the disenfranchisement of females in athletics, and right. I would have never taken that course, but I still think about it today, right? And it was interdisciplinary. I was a music major taking the history of sports, of female sports, right? So how do we move past and being able to create an environment that does allow for this? And your work is impressive because you can talk about the Moody Center, right? For creativity and music and innovation, to the Humanities Center, to global. You're an example of it. You really are an example of what you write in the book of here's what to do. But how do we get more people to do that?
Great question. I mean, I really think it has to do with the person and the person's willingness to be curious and keep learning. I think that's part of it. So we can encourage students to have that desire. And I don't think we do enough of that. I think students come out of K-12 already, as I mentioned earlier, kind of, a little bit circumscribed in what they believe they're good at. So I think we all have a responsibility to encourage students to test, to try different things out. And, audit a course. If you're scared to take it because you think you won't get a good grade, audit it, for heaven's sakes, or sit in on one class and see what you think. I think there's little ways that we can do it. I mean, Rice is a great institution because our student-faculty ratio is so good, and I think we have a lot of opportunities for one-on-one instruction and suggestion for students. We all just need to be committed that success at the end doesn't look like a student who has an A+ in their major. That's not the vision of, that's great, but for that student to really thrive in this climate, in this marketplace, they have to go into the marketplace able to talk about, what was their biggest discovery work while at the university? How, give us a story of setback and failure and, your learning experience out of it. And I don't know, when I interview candidates for jobs, I don't look at what their GPA is at all.
Ever.
So, right. So I think that, students often think, they're so fixated on the GPA to get into college. And then, of course, look, a high GPA does all, depending on if you want to go to medical school, of course, I'm not trying to minimize it. That said, I think there's a whole other area of expertise that we just don't we let students off the hook of actually sort of greater capacity coming out of our schools than we should.
Yeah. And a part of the ending of the book is this call for higher education to clearly demonstrate value and impact to students, families, and stakeholders. And in our political climate today, so many universities are under attack and are in a position now where they're having to reactively count the ROI, right, of research grants, of its impact on knowledge and medicine and war. But you really say there's one piece of advice, or that colleges should really do a better job of ROI, explaining that to faculty or to students and families. What is one piece of advice that you could give to institutions, faculty, staff, administrators, on why this is so important and how they should do that relative to students and families?
Yeah. So I think, we have thousands of U.S. colleges, universities, community colleges. It's not one industry. It is one industry, but it's a very sectored industry. And that makes it hard sometimes for us to deliver a unified message. And so often I think universities are on the receiving end of critique rather than setting the discussion. So that is something we need to get better at. And look, truth be told, most presidents of universities, came out of academia, right? Not necessarily trained in all of these strategies, right?
Of storytelling.
Right, all of that. So there's reasons why this is the case, in addition to the industry itself being so bisected. But I think that said, fact is, a university education is the strongest credential that we can give the next generation for success over time. And, we are huge employers in urban areas, in communities, right? So it's not only, I think the focus is, the tuition is so high. Universities employ a large number of people, right? They are economic engines in their communities. And the workforce that they, graduate then go on to keep those industries thriving and grow new industries. And so I think we need to be better telling that story. It's a story of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And within universities, we're not-for-profits, right? So for our faculty, this is not kind of where we would think first.
Yeah.
But that said, because there's so much confusion around universities, I think we can't ignore that our public needs to understand what our value is to the public. And, the value is quite clear. It's uncontroversial. It is supported by data. And so we just need to be clear about all that. And I would say, when we talk about return on investment, students have a responsibility to get their own return on their investment. And so I would encourage students and their families not to approach this process as a customer or a client, but as a co-creator, mm-hmm. right? And that's a very different mentality. And you will get out equal to the investment you put in of your own creative capital. And so that, I think, is a huge missed opportunity for students.
Yeah. And it's not just that entire mindset is not just with higher education. It's with your first job.
Sure.
It's with your profession afterwards, sure. What you put in and what you're willing to learn and engage and take on and take advantage of. And through hard work, opportunities will come. And
right.
I think that's a really good lesson for the students as they come in to take advantage of the Career Center, take advantage of internships, take advantage of faculty relationships, those things that really require their initiative to help their university experience beyond knowledge acquisition.
I've been on a lot of TV shows right now because it's admission season, mm-hmm. and the topic is what should students and their families be thinking about. And I say again and again, just as you're told, don't focus on the wedding, focus on the marriage. Don't focus on the acceptance letters. Focus on the college experience at this point, right? So immediately start really doing your research. You've got months ahead before you matriculate. Do your research so you arrive day one knowing all of the wealth of these offices and opportunities that are there for you, so you're not overwhelmed.
Yeah. So in closing, is there anything I didn't ask about the book that you want our listeners and viewers to know, or any questions that I should have asked?
Oh, great. No, you were very, very thoughtful, thorough questions. I really appreciate it. And, clearly I'm an advocate for higher education, a real believer in it. And so, I think that it's an important moment in our country to be clear about what we value and to value the right things.
So how can our listeners or viewers get in touch with you? Should they have follow-up questions? And where can they get the book?
The book is available, of course, Penguin Random House, MIT Press, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any website, you can get it quickly. And getting in touch with me is easy. Just email me, Levander, so everything, C and everything except the R in my last name, @rice.edu.
Carolyn, thank you so much for this insightful book and for joining us on the podcast today. For our listeners, as she had indicated, you can purchase Invent Ed at Amazon. And from all of us here at Rice Digital Learning and Strategy, thank you for listening, and we hope that you join us next time on Owl Talk.